So let me introduce the members of the panel. First up to the screen, we welcome Mthwalo Musoni. Mthwalo is an economist with experience leading both statistical and econometrics analysis of economic data sets. He has extensive experience working at community, national, regional, and global taxation, public finance management, and natural resource governance. Welcome, Mthwalo. He's our first panelist. Now, Mthwalo would be joined by Bokaba, CEO, Samenia Telecommunications Council and Commissioner on the Broadband Commission. For over 30 years, Bokaba has been delivering impact in the telecom ICT industry of the MEA region, facilitating collaboration among private sector and government sector entities in the pursuit of digitization and socio-economic conducive policies. We say a special welcome to Bokaba. We have another panelist waiting in queue. So we're standing by. We have Mthwalo, we have Bokaba, and coming to us from down under is Jason Ockaby, founding director of CEG Australia. Jason has over 25 years experience as a professional economist in and regulatory matters and has specialized in the areas of communications, broadcasting, mining, energy, and transport. He has been involved in numerous matters before the Federal Court of Australia, the Australian Competition Tribunal, and in hearings held by regulatory and competition authorities. We have one more finalist to round off the panel, and our finalist here is Kieran Meskel, Head of Regulatory Affairs, Digicel Group. In his current role as Group Head of Regulatory Affairs for Digicel, Kieran Meskel is responsible for the management of regulatory affairs matters for Digicel in the 26 markets of its Caribbean operation. Kieran has over 30 years' experience in telecommunications with a variety of roles across both the fixed and mobile sectors. His primary focus has been dealing with regulated products and services, together with the associated regulatory processes and environment. We say a special welcome to Kieran. So, this is our panel. Our moderator, we're still holding on, but we'll not keep you any longer. Let's get the discussion going. We'll start with Mthwalo.
Yes, please. Thank you for welcoming me to this panel. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this panel. I think I'll first of all start my discussion with talking about some of the challenges that have been noted over time with tax in the digital economy. And I think first of all, it's important to mention that the global tax rules as they are before looking at a form of reform only allowed countries to tax digital companies or any other companies if they have a physical presence in a certain jurisdiction. The global tax rules have also been marred by base erosion and profit shifting from companies taking advantages of the differences in the corporate tax rates across jurisdictions. So essentially, a company could want to register in a low tax jurisdiction to do away with paying taxes in a high tax jurisdiction by moving some of this business. These challenges and these realities are what have led to the certainty of having changes to global tax rules. The OECD initiated a process to look at the global tax rules to review this, which as negotiations went on, they brought on more countries on board in what they call the inclusive framework. This framework has now come up with a two-pillar approach to try to tax the digital economy. The second pillar looks at challenging the differences in corporate tax rates and setting a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%, essentially meaning companies should pay a minimum of 15% on their profits. Pillar 1 of the approach tries to challenge the existing rules with how companies without fiscal presence are taxed, and says that companies that are making a profit margin of over 10% and who are banking in revenues of over 20 billion euros will be subject to a tax on their non-routine profits, the profits above 10% in market jurisdictions where they have this business. 20 to 30% of these taxes will actually be collected. From an ActionAid perspective, we look at the challenges and realities of the digital economy, and bearing in mind that there is need for more and more financing given the realities of the COVID pandemic, and also given the realities that the digitalization of the economy has brought up competition for traditional businesses like TV stations, which would hold adverts, and adverts are now being moved to digital platforms. We look at these global tax rules, and essentially our position is that the global tax rules as they stand will be unfair in the sense that they basically stand benefiting more of OECD countries, the countries that initially started the negotiation process for this. A global minimum tax of 15% seems to skew towards the global rich countries, the OECD countries, and undermines the revenue collection and the dependence of countries in the Caribbean, in the Africa region, in developing world of such corporate income. 15.6% is a percentage of corporate income that's collected in the Caribbean, and with a global minimum tax set as it is, it basically undermines and potentially would mean that we'll be less dependent on corporate income tax. The other pillar sets quite an ambitious revenue base for us to be able to target companies. 20 billion euros would mean that only 200 companies currently that are operating globally would be taxed through this pillar, and these revenues redistributed. Our argument is this threshold is too high, and implementing such would mean dealing away with unilateral measures that have already been put in place by companies to try to tax the digital economy. So with such a high threshold and with only targeting non-routine profits, it will be very problematic, and it will undermine the revenue collection of countries in the Caribbean. The solution to this has always lied in implementing unilateral measures which would challenge the existing rules in global tax rules of having to have a fiscal presence for you to be taxed. Unilateral measures can take a form of digital service taxes, as we have seen increase in the number of countries, but if you sign on to the OECD tax deal, it basically means you can no longer implement your digital service tax. Unilateral measures can take a form of withholding taxes. Unilateral measures can also take a form of formulary apportionment and fractional apportionment on some of the profits that these big multinational corporations are making in particular jurisdictions. The key that is there is trying to negotiate thresholds for which companies will be liable to tax. If countries maintain their taxing rights, their rules for taxing, they can be able to set thresholds at a minimum to be able to collect enough revenues and not only be able to tap into the revenue that's generated by the only 200 companies. Our estimations suggest that a company like Amazon will not be liable to tax given these current rules. But with unilateral measures by companies, by countries trying to tax these corporations, we would see a case where even the small companies are coming on board and being able and liable to some form of tax, which is very important for regulation. I'll end up there for now.
Boka, I'm going to make way for you to contribute.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening from Dubai.
Boka?
Yeah.
Just 1 second. Our moderator is finally here with us. I would still give you the floor, but let me introduce the moderator. I've already done the formal introduction. I understand Mr. Morris is here. So I'm going to hand over to him and we continue under his guidance.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I'm a little bit of a Luddite, so I'm moving between devices and got myself caught in a no man's land. So thank you for your patience. We have an excellent topic here today, and I was listening to Mr. Jameson yesterday, Mark Jameson, and he raised a number of very important questions. The first one of which was part of the question one of you submitted last night, was this question of command and control in the Caribbean. And command and control runs counter to digitization in the sense that digitization has really several vectors, but two of them are that it increases decentralization and transparency on the one hand, or in other situations like in Estonia, or in other situations such as in China, it may enhance the surveillance economy. The Caribbean has to choose which of these iterations it will follow. The other issue which I identified from your papers and your lectures and your work over the years is this question of exponential tech and sovereignty. This is a key question which must be answered and which must be addressed, largely because small get. All right, so the point I was making is that Mark Jameson gave a talk yesterday in which he discussed command and control issues in the Caribbean, and that is that digitization runs counter to command and control in one way. So you have the Chinese iteration where it can enhance the surveillance protocols, and then you have the Estonian proposition where it can facilitate decentralization. The second point that was very important that must be discussed here, and I saw referenced in some of your papers, was exponential tech and sovereignty. Small nations have limited resources, and the difficulty for them is that they have to exist in a digitized world where exponential tech is enforced upon them from the outside. And the question is, what is the relation between exponential tech and sovereignty? The third thing is, we are in a pandemic. There were 258 pandemics in history, and the significant pandemic, which was the 1347 bubonic plague, was one which changed completely the feudal system, the world's economic system, and imposed new technologies on the world. And this pandemic is doing exactly the same. And so we have to answer those questions. And those questions would be, what are the new incentive models that allows governments, small governments, to associate well with their private tech companies, as Mark Jameson pointed out yesterday? What are the new economic models? Because we cannot be competitive in the old way. We cannot be democracies facing exponential tech, and we cannot maintain our tax base if our young citizens become digital nomads. And so these are questions that we have to answer as small countries. And so I open the floor then to each of you to give a 5-minute discussion on your particular issues. I believe our colleague was teeing up Paulo to begin the discussion. Yes, Antuolo, I turn it over to you to give your remarks.
Yes, I think I did stress earlier before you joined the call that, of course, global tax rules need to be challenged, given that they are not fit for purpose. Before we knew about the digital reality, the rules say that you need to have a permanent establishment, a permanent presence in a particular country for you to be taxed. But these are some of the things that have been challenged by processes such as the OECD process, which unfortunately is quite disappointing and won't stand to benefit our countries as much. It won't start to benefit countries in the Caribbean as much. It undermines their ability and the reliance of the Caribbean region on corporate income tax. It undermines it in the sense that it sets a minimum corporate tax of 15%, which in reality does not question where this particular excess revenue will end up, and it will stand to benefit the Caribbean region very little. It also undermines in the sense that with a 200 billion euros threshold given and non-routine profit rule, there are only about 200 companies, 200 big companies that are operating in the digital space that will be contributing to the tax base. And the reality is there's lots of tax revenue that is being lost by countries to increase digitalization. Before would run adverts on TV stations would pay to revenue authorities, but now things are shifting to the digital space. And there was actually more that needed to be done in order to ensure that the reliance of the developing world, countries in the Caribbean, were to be addressed and would be collect more revenue and harness more revenue potential. One solution for this is unilateral measures. Unilateral measures would set the rules to say this is the threshold for a company that's liable to tax in our jurisdiction. If you are making revenue above this threshold, if you're making profits in our jurisdiction, if you've got users and you're collecting revenue in our jurisdiction, you should be liable to tax. This has been done in some countries like Nigeria, India, and has been introduced increasingly across even the European countries that had spearheaded this, and we have seen more revenue being collected. So this is one solution. I'd like to pass it on.
Thank you very much. Boka, could you elaborate and give your point of view on the question?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Gilbert. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening from Dubai to all of you. First of all, Professor, I'm honored to be a part of this virtual gathering of leaders, thought leaders to contribute to this discussion on the digital economy of the Caribbean. And I would like also to take this opportunity to first congratulate the organizer of this CANTO conference and to have this timely conversation on such an important subject. Let me speak from the UN Broadband Commission and the ITU, as we like to say. This is the final decade of action, and 2030 is quickly approaching. Thus, resilient networks and robust connectivity, which are necessary for making the most beneficial use of the internet, lies at the heart of how modern human civilization conducts itself and deals with new challenges, while at the same time paving a path for new opportunities. So we need to make sure that we account for those opportunities while being equally outcome-driven about addressing challenges and issues that require multilateral approaches, dialogue, collaboration, and incentivization steps for the private sector so that sustainable investment and digital development happen at the required pace and desired benefits for the nations and their government are achieved. So the perspective which I would like to give is concerning the market changes and the industry dynamics. With borderless digital infrastructures, such as the internet, new business models have emerged, further accelerating the pace of digital adoption, although here I must add that broadband coverage gap, the upgrade gap, and the adoption gaps continue to persist in parallel, and that's a major challenge area which is much more pronounced now among the changed market realities. One of them is that we are faced with, what we are faced with is the realization that while digital transformation and the increasingly digitalized economy brings many benefits, the degree and sustainability of such benefits heavily depend on the local conditions at hand. Whether digital infrastructure is available and analog complements, whether services are inclusive and affordable, and whether relevant contents and skills are present, how value is generated, and whether it is locally captured. I'm sure you will understand what I would like to come to. Now, because new ways of doing business and of using ICT have also arrived in the Caribbean, and with no exception, you mentioned that the pandemic has served as their catalyst, it is crucial that business continuity, tele-education, government services, digital inclusion, and digital financial inclusion itself be focused on. Now, as regard to emergence of digital platform, and I was hearing the previous panel talking about it, and emanating challenges within for the private sector, and especially for the operators. I was hearing David from Digital and from Digicel, and probably we will be hearing from Kiran. I'm referring to the operators. There are several implications that all stakeholders in the economic value chain need to realize. Now, these implication includes negative impact on revenue, which means decreasing ARPU and profit, and a decrease in employment for those impacted sectors and firms. Number two, revenue loss to government is another implication. Number three, loss of degree of control of government over the non-traditional digital communication service providers, and I'm talking about regulation and policies. Number four, just to list four of them, there are technical issues that relate to universal service requirement, data privacy or consumer protection regulation, fines or redress mechanism taxes. Of course, we have further implications which include risk of privacy and security and breaches, which can also affect business and people across all segments of the society. And let me tell you that children are particularly at risk, and I'm referring to child online protection, and the panel again before us was referring to that. So, not to be long, we see that challenges are tremendous, while the pace of digital service and application is also high. And it is clear that businesses and government that digitally innovate today and adapt to the changing realities of the modern, some may even say the 5G era, will be even more central to an ever more data-driven digital economy. There is one caveat here that we all need to know. There is a real risk that those without adequate connectivity will be progressively and increasingly excluded from participation. Given the nature of the digital economy, and it is imperative there are global level responses to the connectivity gap to ensure that no one is left behind, and including everyone is also among the greatest challenges that we now face as we endeavor to connect the remaining 47% of the world population, including a significant percentage within Caribbean. So this is the global context from ITU, from the Broadband Commission, and if we have time, I will probably address what the governments are doing with regard to the taxation and what is the position of the UN Broadband Commission. Back to you, Professor Gilbert, and sorry to be so long. Thank you.
No, that's quite all right. Good stuff. So, Mr. Maskell, let me come to you to get a private sector perspective on this, then we'll come to Jason. Mtwalo highlighted multilateral issues which are important. And I think I could sum up Boca's contribution that Caribbean governments have to become market makers. They have to build incentive programs and so on, and build inclusive options to ensure the efficiency of telecommunications and payment systems in their countries. What have you to say to that? And what are some of the risks for Caribbean countries in the relationship between the private sector and the public sector in telecommunications?
So, Professor Morris, was that to me?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think I would like to, well, start the same as Bokar, and thank you and my fellow panelists for making your time. I think that CANTO organised and the team have put together a great program. I think that the move to online has its difficulties, but it has also allowed us to have a truly global panel, which I think is fabulous for this. This is an annual event, and I think that this year the quality of the panelists is without compare to previous years, simply because we have been forced online. I think that in terms of where we are, it might be worth just taking stock of where we were even a short while ago. I mean, in pre-COVID world, regional policymakers had already identified the need for the Caribbean to catch up with developments elsewhere. You know, CARICOM had set out its vision for a single ICT space, and countries such as Barbados and Jamaica had set out strategies for the move to digitize their economies. When you think of individuals, the proliferation of smartphones and the deployment of fiber-based networks were underway. And in parallel, the global digital economy was gaining traction in the region, and the move online had started. But that wasn't without its disruptive effects. From a telco point of view, I mean, OTT services cannibalized our traditional roaming and international voice revenues. And they have been a major plank in our network cost recovery. And in fact, they were an external injection of funds from an external economy, because effectively it was hard currency coming into the region. It was a form of remittance. I mean, we've had, the expectations of businesses, consumers, and governments were increasing. And the scope to fund the investments needed to meet these increasing expectations was narrowing because of the cannibalization of our revenues. And then COVID arrived. Overnight, the tourism-dependent economies in the region were floored. We went into lockdown. The tourists were at home, effectively as islands to protect our citizens. We had a moat, the sea around us, and we pulled up the drawbridge, which was the right thing to do. But sort of working and learning from home kicked in, but they put step change demands on networks. And this move that we said would take years to move to digital, it happened in weeks. So we had this step change in how we acted and behaved, and what behaviors were there. And even when we come out of the COVID tunnel, many of these changes won't be unwound. They are there to stay. This step change embedded in our economies and how we live. But what's going to happen now is that the broadband situation, the situation is even worse than before. I mean, the economies we're trying to catch up on, with the US or the EU or other places, they're already starting to emerge from lockdown, and they're starting to accelerate away, putting money into 5G and network investments, because they've also had that step change. But we're still in the starting blocks, or haven't been called to the starting line in some cases. So we're not even running to catch up anymore. We're stopped. And during this period, governments have borrowed to support their citizens, which was the right thing to do again. But their ability then to invest going forward in this catch-up race is severely impacted. The business cases that network operators have had, or would have had a slim business case to invest previously, that has now diminished. And there is now a straight funding gap because of the revenue declines, because of the shift online, because of the step change in demand on the networks, which has a step change requirement in investment and upfront cash. So all this time, then the internet giants, you've seen it of the reportage over the last little while, that the larger platforms are going to produce record profits reports, and then and their owners are happy to burn more CO2 than a small country to go on space tourism at the same time. So we have this huge disparity going on, and we have this going on. You've heard from my fellow panelists on terms of tax, the need for innovative funding, and how the proposal OECD aren't going to address the issues. And I think Jason is going to speak about the moves in Australia effectively to force the digital platforms into fair dealing with those whose investments they leverage. And from a Caribbean perspective, as Trala has said, the OECD proposal will not address the displacement of taxes, especially not sales tax and employment taxes. And like if you look at it, in the OECD in 2017 said that based on their work, that the most effective and efficient approach to ensure the appropriate collection of VAT or sales tax on cross-border business-to-consumer supplies was to ensure that non-resident suppliers register and account for the sales tax in the jurisdiction of taxation. So that the OECD is saying, that's what should be happening, but that isn't what's happening now. If you take, for example, the Jamaican Tax Authority, its website sets out a threshold of 10 million Jamaican dollars for registering for general consumption tax, sales tax. That's about 65,000 US. When you consider the annual subscription price of Netflix, Microsoft 365 software, virus software, it wouldn't take that many subscribers for each of these to be over the threshold. And then you take into account app stores and personal cloud storage, they would also fall into the net. This is not a new tax, simply a realignment of who collects it. And this approach has already been adopted in countries such as Chile, Kenya, and Mexico. And I believe in Mexico, they've actually forced a requirement for a local tax representative. There's lots of people who will say that these types of taxes only get passed on to the consumer, but having these companies register for tax also provides a nexus that would allow for spreading contribution base for universal service funds and contributions to fund regulators. And back to the previous panel, it also provides a local presence in terms of engaging for regulation. The point you raised, Professor Morris, around our young people becoming digital nomads, taxing these people who supply from outside the region into the region, or forcing them to charge tax on the same basis, levels the playing field for regional companies trying to break into the digital economy, who are locally based with local employment and paying local taxes. Trello has mentioned broad-based, revenue-based digital taxes, also emerging trends. There has been suspension of some of these as part of the OECD discussions at an international level, but actually US states, in the US where these companies, the big platforms are based, they're still pushing ahead with these digital service taxes. So that overall, I think that we have to look at how we garner the contributions from the platforms. I mean, COVID has exposed the frailties of the current investment model and its shortcomings. As a minimum, certain proportion of taxes raised from those who benefit economically from infrastructure should be ring-fenced to fund necessary network rollout. For those who prefer to invest directly, a variation of the Australian model to be used, with a pay-or-play approach being an option for those who wish it linked to an obligation for the larger platforms to deal with network operators. So overall, I think that the global high-level global issues that have been identified by the other panelists can be related back to the region. In terms of power, and we say we're small nations, I think the head of the International Bureau of the FCC is a speaker, I think, on a panel this afternoon. I would remind any ministers listening that when it comes to the ITU or UN, the US has one vote, Montserrat has one vote, Guyana has one vote. As a region, we have more votes than North America. You aren't without power. And I would, those who say that it's difficult, yes, it is difficult, but it is not impossible.
Thank you. Now, Jason, the bases are loaded for you. The difficulty we have, as the panelists have pointed out, we have small nations here in the Caribbean. We have large external forces imposing, such as the OECD, imposing tax rules on us. At the same time, digital technologies that we thought were 20 years away suddenly came into being during the pandemic, but we didn't adopt them. We didn't have an adaptation period we move straight to adoption, and therefore we don't have the protocols in place, the strategies in place, the systems in place to develop a fully coordinated and aligned system. So tell us what the experience is going to be and how do we bring these things into alignment? And should we be looking for some sort of global agreement on some basic systems and basic agreements, and then individual countries set out their individual platforms in their best interests? The floor is yours, Jason.
Thanks, Professor. So I'll talk through the Australian experience for a little bit, and then hopefully there are some lessons for your region. I think there are, and they come in the Australia is a well-developed economy, but it is really relatively small on a global scale for these digital platforms. And so the approach taken by the Australian government was novel, and in some ways it was a high-stakes poker game where each of the digital platforms threatened to leave Australia if the government continued on the course. But nevertheless, it has resulted in some substantial payments being made by the digital platforms, particularly Google and Facebook, to news publishers in Australia. So there are some interesting lessons in the way in which the Australian government and the competition regulator here has really brought the digital platforms to heel when many thought that was not possible. So I think it is fair to say that Australia has been the leading regulator globally when it comes to dealing with the digital platforms. An important precursor to any regulation was a long-running inquiry that the ACCC, our competition regulator, undertook. That inquiry took 2 years, and it forensically examined the way in which the digital platforms interacted with the economy, and they were focused on the impact of the digital platforms on news publishers. That was the primary focus of the inquiry, but the findings were much broader. They found that the digital platforms had substantial market power and were influencing a range of markets, and that has triggered a number of investigations that are ongoing. So I think an important precursor was a detailed and forensic inquiry which set out what the digital platforms do and how they affected the economy. The sort of main way in which the Australian government has proposed to regulate the digital platforms is through a code of conduct. And the code of conduct covers how the digital platforms must deal with other businesses, in particular news publishers and other producers of journalistic content. So initially the proposal was that they would just consider sort of non-price issues, but ultimately the code of conduct sought to deal with how much the digital platforms should pay to news publishers for the use of their content. And so that was a substantial intervention, and the passing of that legislation in Australia resulted in substantial debate, with both Google and Facebook threatening to leave Australia, and Facebook indeed withdrawing Australian content from its platform for a brief period. So in terms of, it's been described as a face-off or a showdown, there were substantial threats made from both sides, including penalties and changes to taxation arrangements. I'll just talk briefly about a couple of elements of the code, which I think are just interesting, novel elements. One is that the code has actually not come into operation. It's a threat to regulate, and the threat of regulation is what has brought the digital platforms to the table in terms of negotiating. So it's not actual regulation, it's the threat of regulation. The second element of the code, which is interesting, is that it didn't really prescribe how much the digital platform should pay to the news publishers. It left that quite open. And the third element, which is the most interesting, was that it proposed an interesting form of arbitration that's not used in many places. And the form of arbitration is called final offer arbitration. So in typical arbitrations, two sides propose put their views to the arbitrator, and it's up to the arbitrator to arrive at their own view as to what the amount should be paid. And that's typically a point in the middle for many people who've been involved in arbitrations. But in this case, the arbitrator's hands were tied. They had to pick one of the offers from the parties, either the Google's offer or the news publisher's offer. And that's created really interesting incentives in terms of neither party would put in an unreasonable offer or a totally unreasonable offer for fear that the other side's slightly more reasonable offer would be accepted. And so the economic incentives were to bring the parties together more quickly, and that's indeed what happened. It streamlined the process considerably. So as it currently stands in Australia, Google and Facebook have reached agreement with all of the major publishers. It is reported that the figure that has been agreed for Australia in total by both Google and Facebook combined is 500 million Australian dollars. So that's a significant number at $20 per person in Australia for the avoidance of regulation. So hopefully there's some lessons there for you.
Thank you, Jason. That's very, very insightful. I like the economic incentive of the arbitration process. I'm going to take that under advisement. So Mthwalo and Boka, I want to get your view on something. Given what your other two colleague panelists have said, shouldn't we be looking for some sort of global agreement? And when I say a global agreement, I mean the OECD's or the United States global tax model. Under the Vienna Convention on treaties have to be reciprocal. So shouldn't small countries put a bid to say that we need to protect our tax base as well and put that into any global agreement and negotiate that, and negotiate it perhaps using some of the Australian protocols which Jason just outlined. After all, we find ourselves in a situation where if that tax model, if the questions around taxation is not settled, these Caribbean countries will not be democracies in the sense of taxation with representation. And if you have a situation of digital nomads, you already have a with I negotiate for Turks and Caicos with Airbnb, but there are other companies, like lots of Caribbean countries have spent millions of dollars on universities, but there's the free University of the People online, which citizens can attend without registering anything with their local Ministry of Education. Someone can work on Fiverr or Upwork and receive their pay in PayPal with no registration for national insurance or national health insurance. So people can live from their countries, but not in their countries. Should we use, is the global minimum corporate tax, the global corporate minimum tax, is that an option for small countries to negotiate bilateral arrangements to protect their tax base so that we get a streamlined notion across the world on these service taxes in the digital world? Go on, Mthwalo.
I'll probably go first. I think you rightly put it. The challenge that comes with digitalization is the shift of business models beyond what current rules can tax. So if I am going to stay in a particular country, yet do my operations on the digital space, contribute so much in revenue, and my government is not collecting, it basically means that my government is losing out a lot on the potential revenue that could come from the sort of business I am doing and the sort of operations I'm conducting, even on my social media, the advertising I'm doing. Unfortunately, the current global platform, which is negotiating these rules, the OECD, had started creating these rules on their own and only included countries from the Caribbean and Global South, an advanced stage of negotiation. I made a point to say that the decision to have a corporate minimum tax on 15% undermines the need for the Caribbean to make use of these revenues to ring-fence the growth of the digital space, to ring-fence probably education on digitalization and so on and so forth. The decision to have thresholds at 200 billion euros, which is way above the emerging, the middle companies that are operating in the digital space, shows that this platform hasn't heard the views of countries in the Caribbean. And besides, we're only sharing non-routine profits, the profits above 10%. The 10% would still end up in the rich countries, which are already undermining our ability to generate revenue, which are already undermining that. Even in our countries, adverts have moved from TV stations and are now on digital platforms. Digital platforms are extremely profitable, increasingly profitable, at the expense of local businesses, traditional businesses, and that ultimately is at the expense of tax collection. What should we have done better? First of all, I think a UN tax body should have worked better because all countries would have been at an equal footing to negotiate such a tax deal. Negotiating at an OECD level led by the rich countries is an outcome looking to benefit rich countries more, is just reflective that this has not been at an equal footing. And basically, we need to look at renegotiating such deals or abstaining away. I gave an example to say, with unilateral measures in countries where you set a threshold to say, if you are making your revenue above this threshold, or if you are making any profit here, you are going to pay tax. You are certainly going to collect more tax from a unilateral measure, from a global sales tax as well, like was in European Union, than what is being proposed in the current OECD tax deal. Unfortunately, the deal comes with a condition, and the condition is your progressive regulation for collecting some form of tax from the digital economy should be dealt away with, and let's just look at sharing profits, non-routine profits for companies that are making revenue of excess of 200 billion euros. It's very unfair. It's something that countries need to look at. Emphasis was placed to say there are a big, huge number of countries in the Caribbean. This is going to affect all countries. Negotiation under the OECD base erosion tax deal is only guaranteed after 7 years. So for 7 years, it will be undermining the ability of the Caribbean to actually collect the revenues. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Boka.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. I would like to bring a different perspective on it. It's a very complex discussion, and we also have to be fair to all the stakeholders, because including those that we are talking about, and let's name them the internet companies, are bringing value into this dynamic market. So they are a part of the business. Someone also has to defend them. The Broadband Commission recognized that efforts are ongoing at the international level with OECD at the forefront to undertake global tax reform. And these aim to address the international taxation challenge with multinational, let's call them enterprise, capable of generating value from tangible or intangible assets in one jurisdiction and being subject to taxation of its consolidated profits in another, most often lower taxation jurisdiction. With this in mind, even if tomorrow globally we agree that taxation is going to happen, it's not solving our problem. It is not solving our problem. When I'm saying our problem, I'm talking about the ICT industry, because the use of proceeds is to develop the broadband infrastructure. With this in mind, and in acknowledgement of the daunting task to finance and fund future infrastructure development, the Broadband Commission recommends that a portion of any such taxes, like the one most of you have mentioned, a portion of it should be designated specifically for financing digital infrastructure development and broadband adoption. I would insist the tax revenue should be earmarked for this purpose and could be disbursed through, now we can analyze, dedicated digital fund or a reformed version of the Universal Service Fund. Keep in mind, if we put the taxes aside, we already have an existing USF in many countries, majority of the countries, and we have a problem with the disbursement of that USF to be utilized for funding the digital gap. So yes, a number of countries, OECD, is advocating for a new tax. Why not? But from the Broadband Commission standpoint, if any tax is applied to those digital companies, let's ensure that a portion of it is going to be recycled back into our industry. So given that the Commission's core mission is to bridge the digital divide and bring the goal of universal connectivity to the forefront of policy discussion and decisions so that meaningful connectivity can materialize for each citizen of the world, which include every still unconnected citizen in the Caribbean region. And because the Commission is a living example of a flagship UN public-private partnership, I do personally anticipate that we will help find remedies to address the evolving issue within the digital economy, including future-friendly regulation, sustainable development, shared responsibility to fund digital development, and thus financial contribute, including through fair taxation and investment. So this is our mandate. Back to you, Professor Gilbert. Thank you.
Mr. Maskell, I wonder if you could address this. Your colleagues have laid out quite an interesting proposition. On the one hand, we have to negotiate in a real world with the OECD to protect our tax base. And there's an avenue to do that through the United Nations on a multilateral basis to ensure that we can protect that. Boscar just laid out another problem, and that is a problem of alignment and coordination. So on the one hand, yes, suppose we say that any tax revenue, a part of it should be earmarked to build out the broadband infrastructure. But governments and private sector interests in allocating those funds are very, very different, because the government is going to be prepared to put those funds into rural areas where districts are very poorly populated, but represent a counting district for first past the post elections. So they are going to put money into those places that are dead zones insofar as commercial infrastructure is concerned. And therefore, there's another set of negotiations that must take place between the private sector and the public sector to make some determination on how those funds would be allocated. What do you say to that?
Thank you, Professor Morris, and thank you, Booker and Tualo. I would agree, and as rational business organizations, we are already investing where we can make money. You know, we're profit driven. I'll make no bones about it. We're profit driven, and effectively, you know, what you've outlined, Professor Morris, is that you have sort of gap funding for those places where we can't make money. And I don't think there's any disparity there. I think that where we can make money, we're doing our own investment. And what you're saying is, look, you know, you're highlighting the fact that actually it's in those areas where we need some gap funding for our investment. And I think it's a matter of properly identifying where the gaps are and the level of the gap. But once that gap funding comes, then we can make money on it, because effectively, you know, either it's in the form of an investment fund that has a much longer payback period than we would get commercially, or it's basically some form of development grant to do gap funding, or there's a commitment from governments to provide anchor tenants in terms of education or whatever. But I don't think there's a disjoint there between those two things. I think that back to Bukhar's point around reinvesting, I think that if we invested in build it and they will come. I think that if you build broadband, yes, the digital players, and we've mentioned Facebook and Google and whatever, but it could be the electricity company wants to do smart metering, or the water company to improve its smart reading to improve its water losses. Everyone who benefits from the digital economy potentially should contribute to it, and where it isn't commercially viable at the moment. So I don't see a disjoint at all.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, Mr. Maskill. Is there an option for a Caribbean-wide telecommunications e-payment strategy? Or are we really silos of 15 CARICOM nations operating on our own, or CARICOM Plus? Is there an option for a Caribbean-wide, unified, aligned, and coordinated strategy?
In terms of e-payments and effectively mobile money, Digicel actually has MyCash, Moncash in Haiti, and we are moving into that space. But as we move into that space, I mean, comes back to sovereignty. I mean, the various Caribbean nations, to their credit, they are independent nations. I like to draw the analogy that Ireland got its independence about 40 years before most of the countries in the Caribbean. So in that sense, when I look at Ireland and I look at the timing gap of what Ireland was 40 years ago, I say, look, there's huge potential and I have huge optimism for the Caribbean. I think the difference was that Ireland could hitch itself to the European star. And we gave up large quantities of sovereignty. I think that it takes time for having got your independence. It takes time before politically the mindset is right to start ceding independence. And I think that it is necessary, if the Caribbean as a region wants to move forward, there needs to be that sort of maturing of identity and ceding. So I do believe it is possible. I think it is challenging given just the passage of time and the ebb and flow. But Caribbean is on a journey. You'll get there, I think. So when I look at the experience in Ireland, I have huge hopes for the Caribbean in that sense.
Very good, very good. Jason, I have an exotic question for you. An exotic question. China has basically created a digital moat around itself.
Hi, Gilbert.
So the internet, yes?
My apologies, but we're going to give you exactly 1 minute to wrap up. We're a little behind schedule, so I have to interject at this time. So I need you to recraft.
Oh, that's all right. Okay, so
your closing process.
If you guys don't mind, okay, I'll take that minute myself. China has erected a digital moat around itself. Singapore is doing something similar. Taiwan is doing something similar. In fact, Audrey Tang hacked the government, and then they hired her as the IT minister. I don't know if we do that in our region. But what's really significant is there a few to think about is the future going to be countries with ring-fenced digital moats around them, and the new foreign policy is going to be interoperability between countries, negotiated between countries in a world of digital moats, where each country is a digital moat. Quick, anybody with a quick response? Yes, no, maybe so?
I'll go, maybe. I mean, one thing from the Australian experience was that the thing that brought Google to the table was the involvement of Microsoft and Bing, saying we can do quite a lot of what Google does if they pull out. And so that created a credible threat to bring Google to the table for the Australian government.
Right.
I'll leave that.
Okay, gentlemen. Well, thank you all very much. It's been wonderful. Brilliant, brilliant insights everywhere. And I'm sure we're more enlightened. And I trust that you remain safe and well, and your families and your employees as well. All the best to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.